In this course section, I'll introduce you to NGRX, a totally optional state management system, or to be precise, a state management library, a third-party package you can add to your Angular projects. And as already mentioned, NGRX is a library, a system that helps you with state management, though in this course section, we'll take a closer look at what exactly NGRX is and how it works, and we'll dive into its core building blocks, its basic concepts which you must know when working with NGRX. We'll learn how it stores state and how that state can be used in components. You will learn about reducers, actions, and selectors, and you will also learn how to work with NGRX effects and what that is and why you might want to use it. So therefore, to get started with this section, let's start with probably the most important question. What is NGRX? And the answer is, it's a state management solution. It's a package you can install into your Angular projects to get some help with managing your application-wide state, because that's what this NGRX package and library is all about. It aims to help you with the management of typically more complex application-wide state. And state simply is data that's used in one or more components in your application that typically changes over time, for example, because the user clicked a button, and where those data changes should then lead to a change in the application, typically to a UI update. And of course, in this course, you already managed a lot of state, either directly in a component by simply storing some data in a property that then got changed as a button was clicked, for example, or if you needed data in multiple components with help of a service where you stored some data in a service, changed it from component A, and then maybe used it in component B, for example, with help of a behavior subject or something like this. So you already learned about state management, and NGRX is simply another solution you could use instead of storing and managing your state directly inside of components or services, and it therefore is a totally optional solution. It's an alternative, not something you have to use, but something you might want to use in more complex applications, since, as you will learn in this section, NGRX gives you a certain standardized, clearly defined approach and way of managing application state. So NGRX is a state management solution, a library that helps with managing state data in your application, and a library that gives you a clearly defined way of managing application state. And that clearly defined approach all starts with creating a store. So once you have NGRX installed into your Angular project, something we'll do in the next lectures, of course, you can and you should create a store, a data store, a state store with NGRX, because that is where your data will be stored and managed by NGRX. And that's also the place to which your components can reach out to read that data. So if a component needs a certain piece of state, if it needs some data, and if it should update when that data changes, it can read that data from that store, and it can listen to data changes so that Angular can update the UI as that data in that store changes. And for reading that data and extracting that data from the store, it can also leverage a concept called selectors, which is a concept defined and introduced by NGRX, and it's actually a totally optional thing, as you will learn in this section here. And therefore, with help of this store and these optional selectors, components can get that globally managed state data. With NGRX, you have that one central store in your application that in the end manages all the data used in your entire application, and your different components can then get the data they need from that store. But of course, getting the data is just one thing. Components also typically need to change that data over time, for example, because a button was clicked or a form was submitted. And NGRX also gives you a clearly defined, standardized way of performing such data changes. Because in the NGRX worlds, to change data in the store, your components must dispatch actions, which in the end describe the changes that should be performed and add any extra data that might be needed to change the data in the store. And then those actions are picked up by so-called reducers, which you define as part of setting up this entire state management system. And in those reducers, you then have the actual logic that gets triggered based on those actions to change the data in the store. And of course, that's all pretty theoretical right now. We'll see all these things in action over the next lectures, of course. Last but not least, there's also one other building block in that NGRX world you should be aware of, and that would be effects. Effects are simply side effects, like, for example, HTTP requests that should be sent to a backend that should maybe also be triggered when certain actions occur. So that an action, for example, does not just lead to data in that store being changed, but maybe also in addition to an HTTP request being sent to a backend. So that's the big picture, and it's probably not 100% clear yet, but that's exactly why we're now going to explore these different building blocks step by step over the next lectures. Now, to get started with NGRX, we'll start with a very basic, simple, dummy Angular app. We'll start with an app that has a counter that can be incremented and decremented. And of course, I really want to say and emphasize this right away, this is not an app where you would need NGRX. Instead, using NGRX for an app like this would be overkill. You would be doing a lot of unnecessary setup work that would not really be worth the effort. But I'm deliberately using a very simple app like this, which is split up across two components for outputting and controlling the counter and a service, to slowly introduce NGRX and all its core concepts step by step so that you could then use NGRX in more complex apps thereafter. But for learning it, starting with a complex app would probably not be ideal. Therefore, attached to this lecture here, you find this starting project here, and you actually find it in two versions. One version that uses ng modules, and also a standalone version where we're using standalone components. Using NGRX, as you will see, will be quite similar no matter which approach you're using, and you will learn about both approaches in the next lectures, and you can therefore then simply follow along with the approach you want to use or the approach you have to use in the project you might be working on in your job. So you find these two starting projects attached, and it's exactly the same app using the same two components and this one service, just with or without ng modules. So now that we got this starting project here, and we got this big picture earlier in this section here, it is now time to get started with NGRX. And for that, in your Angular project, no matter if it's using standalone components or not, you can install NGRX by opening your terminal, your system terminal. And here I'm using the one integrated into my IDE, which in this case is Visual Studio Code. But you can, of course, also manually navigate into your project folder in your terminal or command prompt. And then once you are in your project, in that terminal or command prompt, you can run ng-add, which is using the Angular CLI for adding a library to your project, and then add @ngrx/store. And this must be written exactly like this, @ngrx/store. And it's always the same command, no matter if you are using standalone components or not. And what this will do is it will download and install NGRX, so this third-party library, and it will also go through some very basic setup steps thereafter. So here I'll confirm with yes, and this will now, as mentioned, install those packages. And in my case here, it also updated the app module TypeScript file. And in that file, it essentially added this entry here. It also added this import, which I'll move to the top to the other library imports. And then it added this line of code or this piece of code here in this imports array. And this simply will be the line of code that is responsible for setting up a store in this application. Because as I mentioned before, when using NGRX, you have always one global store which manages your application data. And that's the store that's getting set up with this line of code here, though of course at the moment it doesn't contain any data and it doesn't contain any logic for changing data. But that's what we will add over the next lectures. Now if you're in a standalone components project, it's exactly the same command. You would run ngrx/store is being added with ngadd @ngrx/store. And again, it will download and install this package and then also update a file, in my case here, the main.ts file. And in that main.ts file, it now added this piece of code here and this import, which again does create that global store. It's a slightly different piece of code than in the ng module based version, but in both cases, this code here simply creates an empty store. And of course, we're now going to fill that store with some life and data over the next lectures.